I am not entirely sure whether architecture today has a different role than it used to have, in the sense of providing, you know, divisions in space that allow us to organize our lives. What I do think is that architecture as a separate field is becoming less and less independent, like many of our other fields of inquiry. The idea that you would put something in space, like a wall or a roof or a piece of grass, and that is semi-permanent, I think that is obviously going to disappear, in the sense that many of the stable aspects of our life are disappearing. I really don't see why, in terms of interface, a wall is such a, intelligent solution to a design problem. A permanent wall, it is. So I suppose that it will become much more fluid and merge with other design disciplines and cease to exist as its own, let's say, as its own practice. Also, when you look, for example, at the way that we are designing buildings, I suppose that a distance between designing a building and the actual construction is becoming smaller and smaller. Obviously, we already have technologies that completely collapse the two processes, but I think that's another aspect of architecture that is going to be much more prominent in the future. And that again makes the distance between different fields of inquiry and creation smaller. It depends on what my country is. If my country is the Netherlands, where I was born, then there's an argument to make that architecture stands at the basis of our state. That the entire, or at least that's what we learn in high school, is that the Dutch state is the result of the necessity to build in a collaborative way dikes to prevent the land from flooding, and that these infrastructural works were by necessity collective, and therefore they needed democratic decision procedures, and that's the basis of Dutch state and democracy. Basically, the collective attempt to protect farmland from natural forces through architectural interventions. So when it comes to the Netherlands, architecture is an integral part of the state. That in the Netherlands, people say that there's 1 square kilometer somewhere that has never been touched. That there's 1 square kilometer where the government has decided that they're never gonna make a plan about. It's a myth in the sense that there is no such square kilometer in the country, but it kind of indicates how enormously important the organization of space in the Netherlands is, in the sense that it's like super populated, we have very little space, most of the country is beneath sea level. The way that our country is structured, architecturally speaking and urbanistically speaking, is like nearly over-determined. It's very, very precise up to the millimeter. Then if you talk about the country in which I live, it's kind of the inverse situation where, public space is to a large extent underdetermined in terms of design, and to a very large extent unregulated, which I kind of enjoy. I really like the contrast, but I can also understand why it might be very frustrating for people who have lived here longer than I have. When it comes to the role, I think paradoxically maybe the role is the same, in the sense that the role of architecture in the Netherlands is really, like, as I said, is at the base of the state. Whereas here in Albania, they desperately attempt to build a state through architecture. That somehow having an urbanistic plan or a master plan or any type of plan would be proof that the state is functioning, whereas everybody kind of knows that it doesn't. So in that sense, the function of architecture, ideologically maybe, is similar, I suppose. It is proof of the fact that the state works. And then sometimes that's true, and then sometimes that isn't. Well, first of all, I have to say that I didn't visit the Architecture Biennale. So it is difficult for me to, and it would be somewhat maybe incorrect for me to judge the entire Biennale, in the sense that I haven't seen it completely. But at the moment that a report from the front by, curated by an architect that's known for his like social work and work in difficult social contexts. But I think it's very difficult, and maybe I'll return to this, it's very difficult for architecture to be presented in a way such that it really comes from the front. In a sense that for me, architecture is always, or nearly always, related to institutions, and then most of the time state institutions. And as far as I'm concerned, the front is everywhere where the state is not. And so to report from the front, in terms of architecture, I find a questionable proposition, especially when, for example, and this is something I do know about the exhibition, the TID Tower, which is a building here in Tirana, has a prominent position in the central exhibition, whereas that building in no way reports from the front and is rather an investment product that is marketed by a country in order to raise its profile on an international level. Architecturally speaking, it's nothing quite amazing. It's not a 5-star hotel as it claims to be. So I find it very problematic, that example. If we take that as an example as from the front, then that makes me question the integrity of the rest of the exhibition. Especially, if I'm not mistaken, if even won a prize, I think, within the Biennale. But you have to cut it out if I'm wrong. So I find it problematic as a theme. And I think it is problematic because, again, it is difficult for architecture to be from the front. Simply because it involves such an enormous amount of money usually to actually execute architecture, that the only architecture that could be really from the front is by definition a design and not a construction practice. So like I can think of Constant, for example, like historically speaking. But obviously that's only models and sketches and not anything that actually was ever executed in real life, simply because the costs and the political influence that would bring with it would destroy the project as it existed in his mind. And I think with many architectural solutions to possible problems from the front, a similar type of fate would be in store. So it's very fragile, and I'm not sure if they pulled it off. Again, I haven't seen it. I suppose my answer is slightly cynical, in the sense that I really don't think that an institution such as the Venice Biennial can give any adequate response to social or political situations. It's way too big, way too much money is involved. And if it responds to it, then it's only in the sense of like signaling a trend, I suppose. Like a way of making actual political and social changes in Europe accessible to a group of people that otherwise doesn't really care about struggles in Catalonia, civil war in Syria, refugee problem in Greece, but packages in a way that you can say, oh no, I went to the Biennale and I was really impressed by the works and I really care, but actually not doing anything at all. So no, it doesn't in any way reflect social and political changes otherwise than repackaging them in a way that makes them fashionable. And yeah, sorry about that. I suppose that if there is something like a current European spirit in architecture or in the Balkans, then that necessarily again relates to the way that the state manifests itself. What we are seeing currently in Europe is a strong emphasis on strong re-emphasis on national boundaries, which are obviously have an architectural component, such as border walls, and an attempt to like kind of arrive at a new sense of what is a nation as a way of pushing back against the European Union. And obviously that has an architectural component. I think Macedonia or Skopje is a very interesting example of such an attempt. And in a way Tirana too, in a very different style and in a very different way, but with very similar purposes. The redefinition of an urban landscape through a rather radical architectural intervention by one or very few persons. And I suppose that the re-emphasis on classical monuments, on certain types of cultural heritage, and on the appreciation of certain types of building styles, and I suppose a removal from kind of this international architecture interventions of of museums that are basically no longer connected to any site but only operate on a global scale in terms of architectural spirit. I suppose that that's becoming less. But again, this is like a very superficial analysis. Like I would really have to look and travel much more in order to say anything useful. But my supposition, my working hypothesis would be that the wave of nationalism that we see currently in Europe cannot be without its architectural expression. And that expression, I think in many ways, has started even before politics realized that this is something they could bank on. So, yeah. Well, obviously architecture already has an enormous, if not to say totalitarian, influence on our everyday lives. And I'm pretty sure that networking architects and architecture studios and architecture projects will increase the amount of possibilities that architecture has in order to express itself on the planet in whatever way, and as such have even more influence on the lives of the people who live in and around it. So obviously, the possibilities are great. I mean, in the sense that all networking at some point start to improve the individual capacity of its nodes. Yeah, is there any specific advantage for architecture? I don't know. I don't think so. The advantages of networking for architecture are as good as for any other networking project, I suppose. Well, again, if I would be very cynical, my answer would be that global climate change is a pretty good catalyst, in the sense that will definitely force a massive, or actually it should have already forced a massive rethinking of the way in which we live, especially in cities with their enormous carbon footprint. But clearly we need a little bit more stimulation from external factors before that rethinking happens. So I suppose that would be it is de facto the best catalyst, in the sense that it's not going to happen. And it will be more powerful than any, state funding project or architectural movement or citizens uprising or fascist revolution can ever produce. I mean, we will have to radically rethink the way in which we move through space, how we use space, how we use our resources. It should influence, it doesn't really, but it should influence every single aspect of our lives. And since, at least for people who live in cities, nearly every aspect of our life has been designed, it will influence every single aspect of architecture, because in the end, architecture is nothing but design. I suppose that a future mission of architecture perhaps could be to attend, there will be beings living amongst all of this technology and design. And I'm not so sure whether other fields of design are as conscious about the fact that we live with these things as architecture should be, right? In its ideal form. But I'm not sure if architectures or, forms of architecture or architects are still able to scale back to this, human element in their practice enough in order to understand that that's their essence, really, to take care of the people that, they surround with their work. So that's definitely a challenge.